The Ukrainian offensive into the Kursk region and other parts of Western Russia it's a significant achievement for Ukraine. It probably is trying to achieve multiple objectives, but I don't think right now that it is going to turn the tide of the war completely in favor of Ukraine versus Russia. I think there's still too many other variables at play that will continue to make this conflict more of a stalemate than one side decidedly having the advantage over the other. So for the past 2.5 years now, NATO, including the United States, has been the key conduit of weapons to Ukraine on top of what the Ukrainian military already had. But absent that NATO military support and other types of support, Ukraine could not have achieved what they've achieved over this long stretch of time and basically held out against the Russian invasion. So now it's always very difficult, certainly from here in the United States, to understand sort of the reality of what's happening on the ground a few thousand miles away in Ukraine. But it wouldn't be surprising for Russia to say that they are targeting NATO-supplied weapons being used by the Ukrainians, even in the Ukrainian push into Russia, because that's been the pipeline of weapons into Ukraine for the past 2.5 years. So the now about a week-long Ukrainian push into Western Russia seems to have been almost solely planned from within the Ukrainian military and political level, based on U.S. media reporting. The United States was not given any advance notice that the Ukrainians were planning this or had begun to, or were going to do it until they actually launched it. And now that we're about a week into it, it appears that there have been some relatively small territorial gains by the Ukrainians. How far they keep pushing into Russia is an open question, but there's lots of considerations about what is the overall objective for the Ukrainians here. Is it to sort of puncture this psychological sort of aura of invincibility for President Putin in Russia, or on the Russians' mindset that there was no sort of circumstance would the Ukrainians be able to actually sort of do in a small scale what Russia did to them? Is it also designed to show some of the advances the Ukrainian military has made over the past year with, again, going back to what I said earlier, this infusion of NATO and Western supplied weapons and using new battlefield tactics and integrating them with other weapons and capabilities they've had. So it's sort of a demonstration of capability, or a new capability, not only to the Ukrainians, but to the NATO countries that are backing them. Is there also some consideration to however much territory Ukraine can seize, whether that will be used as some kind of bargaining chip if there is some kind of ceasefire or post-conflict negotiations where both Russia and Ukraine will have to start negotiating about how to end the fighting that's been going on for 2.5 years. So there's a lot of different perspectives out there right now. It's not clear how this is going to sort of be resolved. But I don't think, at least right now, that this fundamentally changes the course of the war, because Ukraine is still undermanned. From that perspective, Russia enjoys almost a 10-to-1 advantage in terms of manpower. So, and the eastern border of Ukraine, that front is about 600 miles long from north to south. So even though Ukraine has done well sort of making this push into this small patch into Western Russia, there is still a much larger battlefield front and all these different battlefield dynamics. And again, Ukraine doesn't have the manpower that Russia has. So it remains to be seen how significant of a strategic victory this is for Ukraine at the moment. So lots of layers to that question, but going back to the first part about sort of Putin's strategy or mindset towards a ceasefire, it doesn't look like that is on the table anytime soon, because again, Russia still holds a significant, or is holding a significant amount of territory in Ukraine, including the Crimean Peninsula. And I would have to think that for Vladimir Putin, that whenever that moment is for a ceasefire, probably not now, but whether it's 6 months from now, a year from now, he's going to demand that some of these Russian territorial gains get frozen, and that territory now gets ceded to Russia. So far, President Zelensky on the Ukrainian side, conversely, has said that is completely unacceptable and that Ukraine will keep fighting until every inch of Ukrainian territory is liberated. But that is going to be a tough fight. And again, 2.5 years into this, and the Eastern Front in Ukraine is significant, and there's tens of thousands, if not more, Russian troops sort of stretching all along this 600-mile front. Second part of your question about U.S. planning and support for the more recent Ukrainian push into Kursk and now other parts of Russia, that, at least based on U.S. media reporting, that does not seem to be the case. No U.S. government official, all the way up to President Biden, the Secretary of Defense Austin, Secretary of State Antony Blinken, none of them have said that the U.S. was actively involved and aware in supporting this Ukrainian operation. So from the mouths of the most senior officials here in the United States, that Russian claim doesn't seem to hold much water. And with respect to U.S.-Russia relations, I mean, they're pretty bad. They've been bad for quite some time. They're at a low point now because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. There was a break going back a couple of weeks with the swap of the prisoners on both sides. But as I said in a few interviews back then, that it was great at a human level, that certainly on the U.S. side, that we got 4 Americans back, but I didn't think it was going to lead to a complete reset of diplomatic relations between the United States and Russia. And I still think that's the case with Russia and Ukraine. As long as Russia continues this offensive into Ukraine and maintains that everything they've been doing is justified, which clearly it is not, and they don't, there's no accountability for Russia for what they've done, that U.S.-Russia relations will remain in this very, very difficult moment where they are now. I don't see them getting better anytime soon. That's a great question. So the role of the UN in this conflict has been very limited, other than meetings at the Security Council and sort of coming up with resolutions to stop the fighting. But because of the way the Security Council works, and with the US and Russia being permanent members and each having their own sort of veto power within the Security Council, right now it doesn't look like there's a lot of momentum for any kind of international or UN-backed peacekeeping force to end the conflict. And the only scenario in which that would happen, and even then it's still, I would think, low probability, is for there to be a negotiated ceasefire under terms that both Russia and Ukraine can live with. But right now, as I mentioned earlier, neither President Putin nor President Zelensky seems to have the appetite for a ceasefire, because they each think they've made significant gains, or they think that by trying to negotiate for a ceasefire now, that each side would wind up losing more than winning. So it just doesn't seem that the prospects for a major role for the UN, at least from a peacekeeping perspective, are feasible. But it doesn't mean that they still can't meet at the UN and through the Security Council to try and sort of put the conditions or the beginnings of a ceasefire plan in place. But that also isn't happening yet either. So I'm not optimistic about the role of the UN at the moment.